Come fly with me, let's fly away. If you can use some exotic booze, there's a bar in far Bombay. Come fly with me, let's fly away.
How did Michael Timothy Foley, a boy with the same last name as the rural Florida town he came from, meet and fall in love with an international British flight attendant? We will learn more about how this fairy tale romance that covered 3 continents unfolded, and how Michael and Carol came to eventually live and raise their family and become successful Florida business owners. For now, let's start at the beginning.
I'm Michael Timothy Foley. I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, April 12, 1938. Probably when I was about 2 weeks old, I came to Foley, Florida, which was named for my grandfather. He moved the mill there, the Brooks Scanlon Mill, in 1929. He had an argument with the then Atlantic Coastline Railroad. I think today it's probably Amtrak. He said before he would pay those rates, he would move the mill closer to where the lumber was. So he moved the entire mill to this location, which is near Perry, Florida, 5 miles away. And it was named for him. It was called Foley, Florida, and that's where I grew up. And my best friend at that time was Mike McCain, and he lived across the street. His father was the head of the lumber logging crews. That's how I remember Foley. The only paved road in town went right by our house. And our house was built originally by my Uncle Harold, who came to Foley, Florida to help his father, J.S. Foley, who was the manager and president of Brooks Scanlon at that time, and the Foley, Florida division.
A book later written by the Brooks family says Grandpa Foley saved the mill and a whole lot of jobs and families in the process.
The town of Foley was actually built during the Great Depression in 1929. The Brooks in their book said that my grandfather Foley, Jeremiah Foley, was the one that kept them from going bankrupt during those years. So he said he made money even during the Depression.
Business aside, growing up in Foley was not only full of cats and dogs and colorful neighbors, but memories that have lasted a lifetime.
My early days in Foley, Florida, I remember one incident that somebody came to visit my father and talk business. My father must have sent him to me because I'd been collecting tadpoles, and I had a whole bucket full of tadpoles. And this guy came, he said, "I'm a tadpole inspector." He pulled his wallet out and shut it right back. And I thought I was going to die and go to jail or something like that. This guy was not a tadpole inspector. And I didn't have a license to collect tadpoles. Kay was 2 years older than me. She was very protective of me. She used to put her arms around me, and there's places that she says she apologized for hitting me in the head. I don't remember that as a kid. But anyway, I do remember going out and riding my pony Chubby, who had belonged to my sister. It was given by my uncle, Ernest Roebuck. I got thrown by the horse, and I never recovered from that. I looked at the horse, and he looked at me, and I said, "I'm never going to ride again," and I don't. My sister, Kay, had a budgie bird. I had a cockatiel that would say, "How'd you do?" His name was Little Joe. And frankly, I don't know what happened to Little Joe. But somebody gave us a golden lab named Bing, and Bing was stupid. I mean, he really was. And he'd see a bird outside and he'd run and he'd hit his head against the window and that kind of stuff. Finally, we gave Bing to a farmer, I think, and he grew up on a farm. So those are the 2 pets I had. My sister had a dog named Smokey. It was a Cocker Spaniel. And I remember when she got that on her birthday, which was March the 7th. And Smokey liked my sister and liked my mother, but he didn't like me very much. Back then, you didn't have a TV as such. We did a lot of playing of games. We played canasta, and we played a lot of chess. Pretty much listened to the radio. That was it. In Foley, they had westerns on Friday nights, and we'd go to the westerns and watch the movies at Foley. In Vancouver, one of my friends there had a grandfather who had a free pass to the movies. So we'd go to the movies a lot and use the free pass from his grandfather. I like Elizabeth Scott. She used to play a lot against Humphrey Bogart. And Wild Bill Elliott was in the westerns, and he was. I didn't know till later when I got one of his movies off of TV. He never lost his hat. He'd get in a fight and he'd never take his hat off. It was always on. He'd get in a fight and he'd get knocked around, and found out later he was bald. So the films I liked the best were the serials that they had on the different. Every Friday they'd have a serial, a cartoon, and then a main feature. And the cartoons I really liked the Three Stooges. They started in vaudeville, actually. On the radio, I'd listen to Superman, and I'd also listen to the Jack Benny program. But you could use your imagination then, and it was not like today somebody else would do it for you. Back then you used your imagination, and they had the different sounds of, like for Superman, they'd have when he would fly, you'd imagine that the guy was actually flying. They'd put swish and whatever on the phone. Well, we had a Victrola turntable in Foley, Florida. We used to play records quite a bit. Rum and Coca-Cola by the Andrews Sisters is one of our favorites. We learned Spanish that way too. They had a record for Spanish, and they had also records that you direct for movies, and they would play those for people to act out during parties.
In 1947, Milton Joseph Foley, Michael's dad, accepted a job with the Powell River Company in Vancouver, British Columbia. So the family moved 3,000 miles away to Western Canada. It was not only a totally different climate, it was a totally different way of life.
My first birthday party in Vancouver, we had chili, and nobody would eat it except me. They'd never seen that before. So I remember going to my mother in tears and saying, nobody will eat this stuff. And I just couldn't believe it. There were people who didn't eat chili. And so that was it. I had a birthday party at the rented house. Nobody would eat what we served. We had a big backyard, and we'd set up a croquet set. And quite often we'd have people over to our home in Vancouver in 1389 The Crescent. And we had a big backyard, and we'd set up croquet, and I got rather proficient at that. Anyway, growing up in Vancouver, I went to a public school called Prince of Wales, and my sister went to a private school called York House. And Prince of Wales went from grade 1 to grade 6, and then 7 and 8, you had to go to Point Grey Junior High. And I went to Point Grey Junior High, and then I came back to Vancouver to PW. I came back to PW, Prince of Wales, and for my grade 9 and grade 10, I was president of the class in grade 9 and grade 10. And the second half of grade 10, I went to Lakeside in Seattle, Washington, and I graduated from there in 1956. It was a private boarding school. At that time, the most famous graduate we had was Batman. Adam West went there. He's since been promoted to by a guy named Bill Gates, who also went to Lakeside, but after me. So I graduated in 1956 from Lakeside in Seattle, Washington. I went to Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Harold, Les, and Joe, three of my Foley side uncles, all went to Notre Dame. My father, Joe, played for Newt Rockne. He went out as an end, which is what he played in high school, and he got cut. And he went out as a quarterback the next year. He read a book on it, and he made the team. So if Rockne had lived, and I do have a letter that says, you may be the fair-haired guy from Newt Rockne, sent to my father, who was called Milton at that time, but he hated the name Milton. He was Milton Joseph, so he went by Joe. I can remember one time at 1389 The Crescent, it snowed, and people threw snowballs. Some of my friends threw snowballs at a guy driving by, and he called my father. I had a snowball in my hand, but I didn't throw it. And my dad said, so-and-so called me, and did you throw a snowball at his car? I said, no, I had a snowball in my hand, but I didn't throw it at his car. He said, I was looking out the window, and I saw your friends throw the snowball, but I saw you didn't throw it. So that was it. Then he also got me up one night, and a man had asked for permission, a policeman, to search our backyard because a fugitive had gotten away. And he said, I want you to know, my dad woke me up and he said, I want you to know, if you ever got into trouble and went to jail like this guy, I'm not going to bail you out.
Vancouver had its share of high society events, and one of the most memorable events was Michael's invitation to meet British royalty.
Princess Margaret arrived with 3 ladies in waiting and a group captain. It wasn't Townsend, but she had another group captain with her, a pilot. So she came on board, and Carol Brooks said, oh, ma'am, you must play the piano for us, which was a statement. I mean, you couldn't ask a question. You could make a statement. We were briefed on this before. And Princess Margaret looked at her and said, oh, must I? That's all I remember about that. And then I was up in the bow because I was one of the youngest people. And I had a ukulele that I had picked up in Hawaii, and I was playing Ukulele Town. And one of her ladies in waiting said, Her Majesty wants you to come and sit next to her. And we were going into the Lionsgate Bridge at the time. So I went and sat next to her. She said, I command you to play a song about a bridge. So I did London Bridges Falling Down. And we were told before, if she gets bored, she turns to the next person and starts talking to them. So she looked at me while I played the song, and then she turned and looked at the next person. So I got up and left. That's how I met Princess Margaret. She really was beautiful, I got to say that. She was very pretty. She had very beautiful eyes. I went 4 years to Notre Dame and got out in 1960. I went to Cal Berkeley 60, 61. Then I was in the Navy 61. I was an officer candidate at school. 62, I got my commission. I was on an aircraft carrier. Then I got an assignment to Naval Air Station Jacksonville. And I had met Carol along the way, my first stop in Istanbul, Turkey. And then I went to the University of Florida in Gainesville and finished my MBA.
But it was clearly Notre Dame and the tradition of college football that still runs deep in Michael's blood.
Actually, I went out for football at Notre Dame. The coach at that time was a guy named Terry Brennan, who had played for Frank Leahy. I remember saying, well, I'm going to be on the hamburger squad, which just means you're used for punching bags, really, for training. So I went out for football to the coach's office, and the secretary said, he'll be right with you. He's got somebody in with him right now. So this guy came out, and he took all the light out of the room. I mean, it was huge. His name was Angelo Mosca, and he went right into pro ball. He stepped on my foot, and he picked me up like a rag doll and moved me from this side to this side. He said, sorry, kid, I didn't see you. And then the coach came out and he said, can I help you? And I'm jumping up and down, holding my foot. I'd already been injured and I hadn't even gotten to the football field yet. So I said, no, you can't help me. And I left. That was the extent of my football at Notre Dame. So as a result of that, I watch a lot of college football games.
Football and Thanksgiving also go quite well together, along with a special cocktail.
I just love turkey. I love the turkey smell and things. And I remember, I think it was when I was at Cal Berkeley, 1960. We went down to San Diego, and a guy that I knew from Notre Dame and his wife cooked Thanksgiving dinner. And I remember this guy said to me, have you ever tried a Manhattan? I said, no, I've never had one. He said, you ought to try one. And he poured me some bourbon and put some cherry in it, and it went down pretty good. So by the time his wife had finished cooking turkey, and we were watching the Green Bay-Detroit game, I think it was, we couldn't eat Thanksgiving dinner, but she was really ticked off about it. So every Thanksgiving now, I've always had that. Always had a Manhattan in honor of it.
Despite living in Canada, Michael volunteered for U.S. military service and was assigned to aircraft carrier CVA-38, the Shangri-La.
No, I didn't have to go. I was living in Canada at the time, and I was exempt from any of the draft, but I wanted to serve. I liked the idea. I wanted to fly, and I liked the idea of your landing strip being where it was when you took off, where you landed. So I went to the Air Force in Tampa and at MacDill Air Force Base, and I passed their written and their physical exams. The captain there said, look, we have a a lot of people now that are left over from World War II, the Korean War, the Air Force Academy, NROTC, or Air Force ROTC, and he said, you want to fly as a pilot? He said, we're kind of full up with pilots, but we'll give you the same training right now as a navigator, and as soon as there's an opening for a pilot, we'll slide you right in. It's the same basic training. I said, well, that sounds good to me. I almost signed on the line. And this guy, the sergeant said, stick around, and the captain left. And he said, the captain's got a quota to meet, okay? This is recruiting. He said, if you really want to fly, go fly for the Navy, because they kill so many pilots, they need them. That's what the Air Force sergeant told me. So I got my uncle in Jacksonville to get me interviews with two Navy pilots. They both lost sons in naval aviation. And they both said the same thing in different words. If flying isn't number one in your life, you'll never be happy till you do it. But if it isn't number one, don't do it. So I said, how do you find out if it's number one? They said, put in for carrier duty. It's easy to get. It's not a good career path. So I put in for carrier duty, and that's how I ended up on the USS Shangri-La, which is now Razor Blades. And I saw some of the most horrendous accidents while I was on the aircraft carrier that you could imagine. So I decided, it's not number one in my life. I don't want to fly like this. And at that time I met Carol. Also, the guy across from my stateroom was in the communications department. So I said, if I'm going to get off of this ship, I better get into communications. So I got into communications. They transferred me to Naval Air Station Jacksonville in communications. And the rest is history then. Well, the first paying job was the United States Navy. I made $222.30 a month before deducts. And I've always said that I married my wife Carol for her money because she arrived here, she had $200 cash. She made more than I made when she flew for Pan American. Well, the first professional job was with Canadian International Paper Company when I sold pulp. And I was basically in training. Then they sent me to newsprint sales in Indiana, and then to Atlanta, as I mentioned. And then I came down here, and I got a paycheck, obviously, from Florida Forest Products.
Your highlight of your professional career is obviously entrepreneurship.
Yes, yeah, it is. In this retail lumber business, basically, we lived paycheck to paycheck because collecting money was a big part of it. And I remember loaning some money, it wasn't a lot of money, to a guy, and he said, I'll pay you next week, or I'll pay you in a month, or whatever it was. Finally, he said, I paid you. And I said, I wouldn't know if you paid me or not. I said, you haven't paid me. He said, then sue me. Well, what? I loaned the guy some money. I never got a note from him. And I had nothing to sue on, so I just walked away. That was the end of it. So, but collecting money was a big thing in our business. If people didn't pay, which a lot of them didn't, we wrote off a lot of money. It was always nice to collect your money.
Did you love your work?
No, I didn't. The toughest times were when we first moved here. We lost our daughter, Catherine, who was the very first one. And she was born June 3rd, 1964. So she was almost 8 years old. I remember Carol waking me up at the rented house and saying, I can't get Catherine to come around. And I tried to shake her too, and she wouldn't wake up. So I said, we need to go to the emergency room. And there was no signs, and we were just brand new here. We really didn't know where we were, how to get places. Finally found the emergency room, and they took her in. And three hours later, the doctor came to me and said, you got to be prepared to lose her. And we did. We lost her. It was very sudden. She had chicken pox, but our daughter Marie, who survived, had chicken pox worse. Just out of the blue, the thing they didn't know much about it was called Rye's syndrome. They do know today a lot about it, but they didn't know much about it then. The doctor said, I've never lost one before. I'm not going to lose one now. And then she died. And he said, I didn't know what to say. He said, I've got a daughter the same age. And he said, I just don't know what to say. That was a really tough time. But I think building this house helped, and then the other children, we had to go on, keep going for them. I always called my parents them and Joe. I never called them Mom and Dad. My children called us Mom and Dad, but I never called my parents that. They were good parents. They did everything for Kay and for me, looking back. And my dad was the same person at home as he was outside the house. Sometimes people are different, but he was always the same, and he always treated us the same.
What life lessons did they teach you guys the most?
Well, stand on your own 2 feet. I think that's the lesson that they said. We're always here, we're a safety net, but you got to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. They never talked about education. They never talked about what I should do or anything like that. They just sort of left it up to me. My mother wanted us to be perfect. She was a perfectionist. My father accepted things the way they were. I can remember one time after they moved here and he had a stroke, and he asked me to hang up his sweater for him. And I said, why don't you just get up and put it on one of the chairs? He said, not in this house. My mother wanted everything perfect. She'd run around behind him, and they had white floors, and she would, any scuff marks, she would take them up. I never saw my parents argue or raise their voice to each other, or I think they got along fine. I never saw, if they did, they did anything in private.
Clear division of labor?
Yes. My mother was great about decorating the house, and my father worked a lot. And he used to have things sticking out of his lapel, and I said, what are those? And he said, that's to remind me to do things.
How do you think you resemble their best and or worst qualities?
I try to be honest, and my father was that way, and my mother was that way. They would tell the truth. Whatever the truth was, they would tell it. I think that's the quality I got from them.
How did your parents meet?
My dad used to tell this story. She got a basketball one Christmas, and she brought it out to play, and my father stole the ball from her, and they were going to play basketball. She went and got her bigger brother Ernest, who was older and bigger than my father, and said, give her the ball back. So my dad did. And then they didn't see each other for a long time. And then they started dating after he was back from Notre Dame. And they ended up getting married. That's all I know about it. But they actually met when my dad was about 10 years old, I guess. As far as I know, the Foleys came from County Limerick, near the town of Limerick, in a town called Moreau, M-O-R-O-E, but it's pronounced Maru, M-A-R-U, like you would say. And I went there in 2008, and I could find no evidence of where the Foleys were in the graveyard, even though I was told there were Foleys out there. And I did find, at the time my grandfather came over here, great-grandfather came over here, the Irish were not allowed to own land. So the Foleys worked for an English family named Barrington in the hills near the town of Moreau. And my great-grandfather Foley came over here in about 1855 because of the potato famine. And he got his way paid by a relative who was already here. And in those days, they had in a lot of the windows INNA, which means Irish need not apply. And they could become firemen or policemen. And I was told he drove a streetcar at some point. And how he ended up in Linden Station, Wisconsin, I don't know. But I did visit his grave some time ago. I think it was 2010. We found his gravesite, and his daughter Sarah, who was my grandfather's sister, but she died young. I don't think he ever knew her. I'm not sure he ever knew his father even, because he was about 4 years old when his father died. And he was Jeremiah Jr., I think, but he never used Jr. That was Linden Station, Wisconsin. Now the Scanlons, who were wealthy farmers at that time, had a store, Scanlon Brothers store, in Linden Station. They were in nearby Boston, which was a bigger town. And my grandfather worked as a telegrapher on the railroad that went there, and he also had a part-time job at the Scanlon Brothers store. And I assumed that's how he met my grandmother, who was a Scanlon. They ended up getting married. They had Harold and Les in Minneapolis. My grandfather got a job with the Brooks Scanlon organization, probably through M.J. Scanlon, who was the brother of my grandmother, Marie Scanlon, who married J.S. Foley. And they were sent to Minneapolis. That's where Harold and Les were born. Then they went to Kentwood, Louisiana. That's where my father was born.